What if I told you that every empire in history, from Rome to the British Empire, collapsed because of the exact same mistake? Not because they were weak, not because enemies destroyed them, but because of a hidden rule that slowly destroys every powerful civilization. And the strangest part? Most people studying history completely miss it. But once you see this rule, you'll start noticing it everywhere. Look, imagine this for a second. It's late at night. You're scrolling through your phone, watching random videos. Maybe a short documentary about ancient Rome or the Mongols pops up. And you think, yeah, empires used to be powerful, but that was a long time ago. And then you keep scrolling. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people never think about. Every empire in history, from the Roman Empire to the Mongols, from the Ottoman Empire to the British Empire, followed almost the exact same story. They started small, they grew incredibly powerful, they controlled millions of people, they dominated entire continents, and then they collapsed. Not one or two of them, almost all of them. And that raises a strange question most history books never really answer. If empires were so powerful, why did they all eventually fall? History classes usually give you simple answers: corruption, bad rulers, economic problems, military defeat. And yes, those things matter, but they're usually just the surface of the story. Because when you step back and look at thousands of years of human history, you start to notice something fascinating. Empires don't collapse randomly. They follow a pattern, a hidden rule that repeats again and again across completely different cultures, continents, and time periods. And once you see that rule, you start noticing it everywhere. Let me explain. Think of an empire like a startup company. At the beginning, it's small, fast, and hungry. The people inside it are willing to take risks. They experiment, they innovate, they adapt quickly to problems. That's exactly what early Rome looked like. Before it became the Roman Empire, Rome was just a small republic in Italy surrounded by enemies. It lost wars. It faced disasters. At one point, it was almost completely destroyed during the Second Punic War against Carthage. But here's what made Rome different. When Rome failed, it didn't give up. It learned. It changed its military structure, improved logistics, and reorganized its political system. In other words, it adapted. That ability to constantly adapt turned a small regional power into an empire that controlled the entire Mediterranean world for centuries. The Mongols followed a similar path. Before Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes in the early 13th century, they were just scattered nomadic groups across the Eurasian steppe. But they had something their enemies didn't: flexibility. Their armies moved faster than traditional forces. Their tactics changed constantly. Their commanders had freedom to make decisions on the battlefield. And because of that, the Mongols created the largest land empire in human history in less than a century. But here's where the secret rule of history begins to show itself. The very success that builds an empire slowly starts to weaken it. At first, empires grow because they're flexible, but as they expand, they become more complicated. More territory, more people, more taxes, more bureaucracy. Managing a massive empire is like running a giant machine. Every new province, every new army, every new administrative system adds another layer of complexity. And complexity has a cost. Historians estimate that at its peak, the Roman Empire had around 60 million people living under its rule. Managing such a huge population required enormous administrative systems, tax structures, and military forces spread across thousands of kilometers. Over time, the Roman government became increasingly bureaucratic and rigid. Decisions took longer. Political corruption increased. Local leaders competed for power. And slowly, the empire that once expanded rapidly started struggling just to maintain itself. This phenomenon isn't unique to Rome, it happened to the Spanish Empire as well. In the 16th century, Spain controlled enormous territories across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. It possessed massive wealth from silver mines in the New World. But instead of strengthening the economy, that wealth created dependency. Spain relied heavily on imported silver rather than building sustainable economic systems. Inflation skyrocketed across Europe during what historians call the price revolution. So, despite controlling vast resources, Spain gradually weakened economically and politically. Now, here's the surprising part. Empires rarely collapse in one dramatic moment. Instead, they slowly lose the advantages that once made them successful. Flexibility turns into rigidity. Innovation turns into tradition. Strong leadership turns into political competition. And while the old empire becomes slower and more complex, new challenges begin to rise. These challenges usually start small, just like the empire once did. But they have something incredibly powerful. They can adapt faster. When the Roman Empire struggled with internal crises during the 3rd century, smaller Germanic tribes and external powers began pushing into its borders. And when the British Empire reached its peak in the early 20th century, controlling nearly a quarter of the world's land and population, 2 world wars and rising independence movements made maintaining such a massive empire impossible. In fact, historians often point out a fascinating statistic. Most large empires rarely last longer than about 250 years before entering serious decline. The Roman Empire lasted longer, but even it went through major crises and transformations during its long existence. So, what exactly is this hidden rule behind the rise and fall of empires? It's surprisingly simple. Success creates expansion. Expansion creates complexity. Complexity eventually destroys the flexibility that made the empire successful in the first place. In other words, the very process that builds an empire also plants the seeds of its decline. And once that process begins, it becomes very difficult to reverse. You can see the same pattern outside of history as well. Think about major companies. Kodak dominated photography for most of the 20th century, yet it failed to adapt to digital cameras. Nokia once controlled nearly half of the global mobile phone market, but it couldn't adapt quickly enough to smartphones. The systems that made them powerful eventually became obstacles to change, and that's exactly what happens to empires. The larger and more successful they become, the harder it becomes for them to evolve. Which leads us to one of the most important lessons history can teach us. Power isn't about becoming the strongest, it's about staying adaptable. The civilizations that survive the longest are not always the richest or the most powerful. They are the ones that can constantly reinvent themselves. They question their own systems. They experiment. They adapt to new realities instead of trying to preserve the past forever. And maybe that's the real secret rule of history. Empires don't fall simply because enemies attack them. They fall because the world changes, and they fail to change with it. So the next time you hear about powerful nations, rising economies, or global superpowers, remember something important. History has seen many systems that looked unstoppable, but the secret rule of history is simple. No empire stays powerful forever. Only the ones that keep adapting have a chance to survive the longest. And that's the secret rule behind the rise and fall of empires. Throughout history, powerful civilizations rose, expanded, and dominated the world. But eventually, they all faced the same challenge. The world kept changing, and the empires that failed to adapt slowly disappeared. So the next time you hear about powerful nations or rising global powers, remember something important. History has seen many systems that looked unstoppable, but none of them lasted forever. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about history, empires, and the hidden patterns that shaped our world, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.